Hi students, it's Professor Tyberg. I hope you're having a great day today. I wanted to give you an example of one of these literary criticism presentations that you will be doing later in the semester. So I created one myself, and the article is a famous article by J.R.R. Tolkien, written in 1936, and it's called Beowulf, The Monsters and Critics. And let's get into it. Okay, his thesis. Tolkien essentially argues that the monsters are incredibly important to the poem and make it a better poem than if they had not been included. He's writing against critics who have argued the opposite. So I'm going to read the thesis here. It is just because the main foes in Beowulf are inhuman that the story is larger and more significant than this imaginary poem of a great king's fall. It glimpses the cosmic and moves with the thought of all men concerning the fate of human life and efforts. It stands amid but above the petty wars of princes and surpasses the dates and limits of historical periods, however important. All right. So he's going to support that thesis. Here's his most convincing point, central point number one about the monsters. The monsters are intentionally central to the plot, which strengthens rather than weakens the poem. And he goes on to support that. He gives these examples of how the monsters belong at the center, and he quotes from a critic who he admires, W.P. Kerr, who writes, quote, "The fault of Beowulf is that there is nothing much in the story. The hero is occupied in killing monsters like Hercules or Theseus, but there are other things in the lives of Hercules and Theseus besides the killing of Hydra or Procrustes." So Kerr is making the argument that there's not enough to the character of Beowulf or his life besides the killing of the monsters, and so the poem is lacking. Kerr's main problem with the poem is that there is a disproportion that puts the irrelevancies in the center, meaning the monsters in the center, and the serious things on the outer edges. So Kerr thinks those other stories about the people and their feuds should be brought to the center of the poem and made more important, and the monsters, Grendel, his mother, and the dragon, should be out on the periphery. And Tolkien argues against that. Tolkien says that he argues for the legitimacy of dragons, and his supporting point to one of them is that more than one poem in recent years has been inspired by the dragon of Beowulf, but none that I know of by Ingeld, son of Froda. So Ingeld is a very minor character in Beowulf and hasn't inspired much literature that I know of, but dragons like the one in Beowulf have inspired a lot of art and literature, and probably even Game of Thrones, like we see here in the picture. So Beowulf, he sees the monsters as symbolic of the transitory nature of life that we often get in Anglo-Saxon poetry. So Tolkien argues that Beowulf keeps the, quote, "the essential in the center, which is the exaltation of undefeated will and man at war with a hostile world and his inevitable overthrow in time." So that's what the monsters symbolize to him, this hostile world and the fact that death comes for all. And Tolkien restates his thesis here, quote, "I would suggest then that the monsters are not an inexplicable blunder of taste. They are essential, fundamentally allied to the underlying ideas of the poem, which give it its lofty tone and high seriousness." So critics argue that the monsters give it this unserious tone, and Tolkien argues that actually the monsters give it this lofty tone, this cosmic tone of deep meaning. His second point, and I don't think it's his strongest point, but I do agree with him. He says that Beowulf is a poem and not a history. I think it's both a poem and a history, but Tolkien says that it's definitely a poem. It's definitely literature. He quotes from critics he disagrees with. Quote, in 1921, Professor Archibald Strong declared, Beowulf is the picture of a whole civilization of the Germania which Tacitus describes, the main interest which the poem has for us, and thus not a purely literary interest. Beowulf is an important historical document. And Tolkien, as an author, is against this. He thinks the poem stands on its own merits as a piece of high literature that English authors should be proud of. Tolkien says that history is secondary. He clarifies his thesis, quote, Beowulf is in fact so interesting as poetry and places poetry so powerful that this quite overshadows the historical content. And he says that historians get confused and think that the poem is more important as a history because this author, the poet, was so talented that he used this historical sense that was interwoven with his story. So his supporting point, Tolkien writes, quote, the author has used an instinctive historical sense, a part indeed of the ancient English temper, and not unconnected with its reputed melancholy, of which Beowulf is a supreme expression. All right, a third major point is about this idea that the Anglo-Saxon writers wove together pagan and Christian themes. And Tolkien argues that the Beowulf poet used the pagan and Christian themes intentionally and skillfully. And so it's not a confusion, but a fusion of these elements, of the pagan elements with the Christian elements. He writes, quote, and in the poem I think we may observe not confusion, a half-hearted or a muddled business, but a fusion that has occurred at a given point of contact between old and new, a product of thought and deep emotion. So he's writing against the critics, again, who argue that Beowulf is muddled with this Christian and pagan. And Tolkien calls, quote, the theory of courage, quote, the great contribution of early Northern literature. And Northern literature is Norse literature, which shared this in common with Anglo-Saxon lit. So the pagan element that Tolkien sees in Beowulf is this theory of courage, the undefeated will that keeps on moving despite the knowledge that death is inevitable. And then he combines that with those Christian elements. And again, the intentional fusion of Christian and pagan. By fusing the Christian with the pagan traditions, the pagan in the poem becomes, as Tolkien says, more ancient and remote, and in a sense darker. So because of the Christian portions, the pagan portions are darker in contrast. And that effect has been achieved through an intentional strategy or technique by the Beowulf poet. Okay. I really like this central point number 4 that Tolkien makes. The critics have been mistaken on genre. They've been all over the place, Tolkien argues. He writes, it's been mistaken as primitive, pagan, Teutonic, an allegory, political or mythical, or most often an epic, or a heathen, heroic lay, a history of Sweden, a manual of Germanic antiquities, or a Nordic Summa Theologica. Too many ideas. The critics have not been able to nail down what category, what type of poem Beowulf is. And Tolkien talks about, in terms of genre, he talks about the structure of Beowulf, and critics have been confused because it's not a narrative poem with a steady advance. Critics have said, it doesn't have this typical plot structure like we see at the bottom of this slide. This is Freytag's pyramid for plot, with the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement. Instead, Tolkien says Beowulf has, quote, in its simplest terms, it is a contrasted description of two moments in a great life, rising and setting. So Tolkien thinks the author intentionally made the plot in a very balanced way, that where it starts with Beowulf's, the beginning of Beowulf's life and fame, and then ends with his death. And Tolkien argues that, this plot structure also mirrors the poetic structure of the individual lines of Anglo-Saxon poetry, which are balanced, on either side of the pause, the caesura. So I think Tolkien makes a really clever point there. Tolkien also ends up arguing that the poem is an elegy. An elegy, if you remember, is a poem of mourning. Critics have noted that there's a contradiction between the first half and the second half of Beowulf. In the first half, we think Beowulf may survive, but then strangely in the second half, the poet makes it clear to the reader that he will die. That, quote, defeat is the theme. Triumph over the foes of man's precarious fortress is over, and we approach slowly and reluctantly the inevitable victory of death. And because of that, the victory of death, Tolkien argues that Beowulf is a elegy. Beowulf is not an epic, not even a magnified lay. A lay is a poetic song. No terms borrowed from Greek or other literatures exactly fit, Tolkien says. There is no reason that they should, though if we must have a term, we should choose rather elegy. It is an heroic, elegiac poem. Okay. I asked you to write about your critic's credibility, and so here's an example of what that might look like. J.R.R. Tolkien, obviously he's a credible author. He was professor of Anglo-Saxon literature at Oxford from 1925 to 1945, and then he was professor of English language and literature from 1945 to 1959. So you may not have known that he was also a professor in addition to being this world-famous author. So he's also credible because he wrote Lord of the Rings, which, gave fantasy this credibility. And now there are literature classes on the Lord of the Rings, whereas at the time when Tolkien wrote this article, that would be unheard of. Fantasy would be thought of as lowbrow literature. And his bias, his slant, obviously he's likely in favor of fantasy. And with this article, he's making a case for monsters and for fantasy. And then he's going to completely exemplify that with his literature that he writes later in his life. So I asked you to write about the author's assumptions. All authors make assumptions, and not all of them are bad. One of Tolkien's major assumptions is that he argues that Greek and Latin epics are not the only valuable mythology. He argues that this Anglo-Saxon, pagan Christian mythology is something that he can be proud of as a piece of English literature. He also makes the assumption that monsters do not make a piece of art campy or lowbrow. Monstrous characters can even heighten the effect of literature. And I already discussed that. He also assumes that strong poetry implies that all the poet's choices were intentional. And today, as English majors, we don't have to make that assumption, but I think in 1936 that was a more common assumption to make by a critic, that a poet's choices were intentional. And I also asked you to make some connections to our class. So I saw connections to from Tolkien's article to The Wanderer that we've already read, because The Wanderer is an elegy, and Tolkien claims that Beowulf is also an elegy, a heroic elegy, he says. So here are some lines from The Wanderer. Longing for a hall and a lord of rings, where near or far I might find one in the mead hall. So there's sort of that longing that you get in a elegy or a poem about exile. And then, of course, the phrase Lord of Rings really makes us think of Tolkien and obviously he read the poem The Wanderer. Then in The Wanderer we also have the Anglo-Saxon irony about the transitory nature of all things in life. Quote, "Where did the steed go? Where the young warrior? Where the treasure giver?" We read about this in your textbook. It's called Ubi Sunt. Where are they now? And there's a catalog, a list of these things. Where are they now? Because everything passes. And we see that in Tolkien's analysis. Tolkien writes, quote, "Man at war with a hostile world and his inevitable overthrow in time." So he also agrees with that interpretation of Anglo-Saxon literature. So that connects back to last week. And then I have several discussion questions, and I think I'm going to put these on our discussion board rather than read through them right now. But they're all based on Tolkien's article and give you a chance to respond to his major claims. And here's my work cited. And it's from the Norton Critical Edition, but it was written back in 1936. And so that's it for my little presentation here. It looks like I went overtime. You only need to present for 10 to 15 minutes. So I apologize for going over, but I hope you have a great day, and I hope this example helps you. Okay,